and contain the situation in Haiti. So that is the situation in Haiti now as it unfolds. But I think we have Dr. Marlene Attz on the line. Do we have her on? Our guest this morning is, our first guest this morning is Dr. Marlene Attz, and we want to bring her to you visually so that we can have a conversation with her. She's a very knowledgeable person on economic issues, and we'll get her to say who she is so that you will better understand who she is and the value of what she's saying. Good morning, Dr. Attz. How are you? What? Morning. Do we have a good connection now, Dr. Attz?
Yes, I inadvertently allowed Murphy into the room, so.
All right, okay. Well, first of all, good morning to you, and thanks for agreeing to come on the show. And we will talk this morning a little bit. And you are an economist at the University of the West Indies, and you've been there for some time. But you have also served on the Economic Development Board, which evolved into the Economic Development Advisory Board across 2 administrations. Is that correct?
That is indeed correct. I had the pleasure of serving under the Economic Development Board when you served as Minister of Planning.
Yes.
And then the Economic Development Advisory Board when we had a new Minister of Planning under the new administration. So yes, I've had that opportunity.
Okay, you've also had the opportunity of working internationally at the IDB. And could you talk a little bit about that?
All right, that was back in 2004 through 2006. Essentially, I had responsibility for working in the Sustainable Development Department at the IDB in Washington, and looking specifically at issues of disaster risk management in the Latin American, Caribbean member countries of the IDB, and trying to bolster their response to disaster risk management in the context of their sustainable development trajectories.
So as far back as 2006, before the current Millennium Development Goals, you were already engaged in issues having to do with, one, economic sustainability, and secondly, the whole business of sustainable development, and thirdly, the disaster management part of that to assure sustainability even in the face of disasters by building capacity and resilience in those countries.
Absolutely correct. My research interest, as it started off in those days, so when I did my master's, it looked at the issue of sustainable development. It is something that I've always had an interest in. And then when I did my PhD, I looked at work on climate change, which was a new emerging area for us in the Caribbean.
Yes.
So I looked at the issue of climate change and how it can impact on our sustainable development trajectories. And then, of course, as my professional life took off, I started to look at development issues squarely and all of those issues that could impact on development, and how does one build resilience and how does one build capacity, as you correctly said.
Okay, and now today, climate change is at the center of every discussion of development, and for the Caribbean islands and for the Caribbean generally, the issues of climate change and sustainable development are at the heart of the most pertinent considerations of how the Caribbean and each country in the Caribbean needs to approach this issue of development. Is that correct?
Yes. Climate change is one such issue, is one such driver, but it's other kinds of disasters generally. So you have climate change, you have our regular hurricane seasons, which one can associate with climate change. But even outside of that, you have the dry season, which bring other kinds of disasters. And then more recently in the Caribbean, we have had to confront a pandemic, which is a major disaster that can impact on our economic systems and ultimately on our sustainable development trajectory. So we have had to learn very quickly to pivot from the environmental disasters to which we've grown somewhat accustomed to deal with a health disaster, pandemic, which could have even greater catastrophic effects than those to which we've grown accustomed.
Okay, very good. I'm going to shift a little bit now to Trinidad and Tobago. And what I want to focus on now is, give me your background, give me your thoughts. And I simply want to mention that you have taught for many years at the Economics Department of the University of the West Indies. That's correct,
yes,
right?
Yes, I have.
Okay. And so financing development is a big issue in the world. How do you get the money to put behind development strategies in order to make development happen? And you are doing that in the context of two things: economic sustainability on the one hand, because you don't want what you are doing to crash. And secondly, you want it also in a financially sustainable manner, because you don't want to put money in and you find 5 years later you cannot continue. Mm-hmm. And then finally, you are doing all of this within the context of sustainable development, which means not just finance and economy, but you're talking about the environment, you're talking about the involvement of people, you're talking about basically the consultative process that continues. All of these things are now essential to the development process. And I know that you are big on this, so I wanted to give you an opportunity to just say a few words on that before we get into the meat of Trinidad and Tobago financial and economic situation.
Yes, financing for development has always been a challenge and continues to be a challenge. For us in the Caribbean, we have what we call high debt to GDP ratios, meaning that for many of the Caribbean countries, we've been borrowing for several years, and the amount that we're borrowing far exceeds the amount that we earn. So by the time we have to repay, as in all loans when you borrow them, by the time we have to repay, a greater chunk out of what you're earning has to be used for debt servicing. Some of what we've been borrowing has been loans to finance development, but some of what we've been borrowing also has been loans to deal with the impacts of disasters. So those countries that have been
You're talking region-wide now, huh?
I'm talking region-wide now.
Yes,
I'm talking
right.
region-wide now. And then I'm going to zone in a little bit on Trinidad and Tobago's specific case.
Yes.
So yes, some of the borrowings have been to engage in reconstruction, recovery and reconstruction, post-hurricane disaster or tropical storm disaster. So you think of Grenada's case with Hurricane Ivan. You think of Jamaica back in 1988 with Hurricane Gilbert. We've had a long history in the Caribbean of being impacted by disasters. But some of the borrowing that we engage in also is for consumption. So you borrow to finance, let's say, capital expenditure projects. So you want to build roads, you want to build highways, you want to put in water infrastructure, etc. And that in itself is not bad. But one also has to ensure that when you are incurring debt, the debt itself must be sustainable. So when you have a debt to GDP ratio that is 100%, meaning everything that you can possibly earn has to be used to service a debt, that is not sustainable. Because it means that you don't have what we call fiscal space to invest in some of the things that are required to deal with development in your countries, in the specific country. In the case of Trinidad and Tobago, we have been fairly lucky, given that our economy has been based on a buoyant energy sector. So we've had significant windfalls from oil and gas. And those windfalls have allowed us to put aside something for a rainy day in what we call the Heritage and Stabilization Fund. So in Trinidad and Tobago's case, we have been borrowing. We have borrowed in the past. We continue to borrow now. And our borrowings have been for budgetary support in the main, to support things like capital expenditure. But in recent times, our borrowing has been for budgetary support and to provide support to the health sector, given the impact of COVID-19 on our economy. So we do have some savings in the Heritage and Stabilization Fund. At the last count, the Minister of Finance said we had...
I'm losing your voice, so I don't know if you're touching anything.
No, I haven't touched. Okay. I haven't touched. Okay, yeah. So in our case, as I was saying, we do have something put aside for the rainy day in the Heritage and Stabilization Fund. At the last check, it was supposed to be about 5-point-something billion US dollars. So let's say round it off to $6 billion US dollars in our Heritage and Stabilization Fund. And the purpose of the Heritage and Stabilization Fund, as the name implies, is that you're meant to put aside something from our energy sector windfalls for future generations. So that's the heritage part. And the stabilization part means that when you don't have sufficient funds or financing for development or for national expenditure, you should be able to draw down or to withdraw from the Heritage and Stabilization Fund. All right, so that has been happening in Trinidad and Tobago's context, but we've also been borrowing on the domestic and on the external market to finance expenditures being undertaken by the government of Trinidad and Tobago. Within recent times, the Minister of Finance has been signaling to the national community that he has been borrowing for budgetary support, including the payment of public sector wages and salaries. So that is what is happening. So we have in fact been borrowing to some extent, as well as earning revenues to the government from the energy sector. Because of what has been happening in the global energy market, where prices are depressed, so they're lower than anticipated, we have not been earning. The people of Trinidad and Tobago and the government of Trinidad and Tobago has not been earning significant revenue from the energy sector. This has been the case certainly since 2015, well, from as far back as 2008, but certainly since 2015, 2016, this has been our scenario. And we have found ourselves borrowing, as I said, on the domestic market, on the international market, but also drawing down on the Heritage and Stabilization Fund to finance expenditures undertaken by the government of Trinidad and Tobago.
Okay, so I'll just say for the benefit of the listeners that you are correct. The HSF is at about $5.7 billion now, and our foreign reserves in the central bank are about $7 billion.
7 billion, which is about 7 months cover.
Yeah, approximately.
Yeah.
Yeah. So basically, what you are saying is that, first of all, you have the HSF, right? $5.7 billion, and you are borrowing from that. You're basically taking out, extracting money from that. Secondly, you are raising the debt in the marketplace locally and internationally. We are now at about 86%.
80%, that's right, yeah.
And and that translates at the extreme point to about $132 billion. And more than that, not only are we carrying up the debt, but the Minister of Finance came to the Parliament and he raised the development loan ceiling further by another $10 billion, I think. And he has stated categorically that we have to borrow, and that his position is that we have financing challenges and we have to borrow. And when you borrow and you have savings, you have to assess the savings against the amount that you borrow, don't you?
That you borrow, precisely,
okay.
Yes. Yeah.
So if you have $5 and you borrow $15, I mean, you have really, with the debt, eaten up your savings because you know. So that is one issue. And let us look at this business of import cover in the central bank from the reserves. Just as the relationship is between debt accumulation and the HSF, and you have to offset one against the other to make sense of what is available to you. The foreign reserves in the central banks are related to the whole business of balance of trade, doesn't it?
That's correct,
All
yes.
right. Explain that a little bit so that people who are watching or listening understand what that is about.
Well, the whole question of balance of trade and balance of payments really talks about your relationship with the rest of the world. How much you import as opposed to how much you export. So when you import, you're actually not importing in TT dollars. You're importing in terms of US dollars because you have to pay your importers US currency for whatever you import.
And that depletes the amount of foreign exchange you have.
Exactly, that depletes the amount of foreign exchange that you have. On the flip side of that, when you export, you earn foreign exchange. So the catch really is to ensure that you are exporting more than you are in fact importing, so that you're earning foreign exchange, precisely, so that you're earning more foreign exchange than you're spending, so that your real balance is a positive balance, so that you have something left in the kitty, so to speak. What has been happening to us in Trinidad and Tobago is that we continue to import significant amounts of food, consumables, so all the cars that we drive, all of the food that we consume, we continue to import those in very high quantities. You would hear a conversation around a food import bill that is $6 billion, and efforts to reduce that food import bill. But of course, those conversations wax and wane. Sometimes when things are very bad, you hear us talking about, needing to re-energize the agriculture sector. But once the dust settles, we go back to the high levels of importation in terms of food and consumer goods. On the other side, in terms of export, our primary export is in fact from the energy sector. But production is down in the energy sector. some of the plants in the energy sector have actually had to close their doors because of the slump in the global energy crisis. So one of the fallouts from COVID-19 is that there was a reduced amount of international travel, which means that there was a reduced demand for things like fuel and energy products. So that had a knock-on effect on economies such as Trinidad and Tobago that are heavily dependent on the energy sector and therefore very vulnerable to any changes that take place in the global energy market. So we continue to import, we continue to incur foreign exchange debts, but we also simultaneously are not earning foreign exchange. So what we have as reserves, as import cover, really constitutes part of what we have to use to service the debt that we're incurring, which is now more than 80% debt to GDP ratio. So it means that our long-term trajectory, well, our medium-term trajectory in terms of foreign exchange is not a very pretty picture. And very soon, the minister, we can't continue borrowing. The last set of borrowing that the minister mentioned was a $204 million loan from the government of China. He also mentioned that we've had some loans from CAF, the Latin American Development Bank, and I think the World Bank or the IDB or both. So we have incurred debt within the recent past, primarily, as the Minister of Finance said, to support the health sector, but also to engage in recurrent expenditures. So expenditures to our public sector workers and some other recurrent expenditures and other mandatory payments that he has to make on a monthly basis. Now, the minister is correct. We are in a situation where we have to borrow because we simply are not, our earning potential is simply not where we would like it to be. But I think the challenge is that we cannot continue to borrow ad infinitum and to raise the debt profile for Trinidad and Tobago. Because raising the debt profile for Trinidad and Tobago means that future generations are going to have to incur that debt. And then they're going to have to pay that debt. And when I say future generations, I think, let me rephrase that. We will all have to pay that debt that we're incurring, and we could find that obligation in the form of higher taxes, as the case might be. But it is absolutely unsustainable for us to be incurring these high levels of debt. And my thinking on this has been, given that structurally our economy has changed, meaning that we're not getting the kind of support from the energy sector that we were used to getting, that we grew accustomed to getting, that structurally we should have a rethink of our economic system in terms of what is going to be the sources of revenue, the different sources of revenue, to help support our recurrent expenditures, but also our medium to long-term to development trajectories. So my conversation has been around a structural adjustment and a rethinking of Trinidad and Tobago's economic space to see what changes can be made and what supporting mechanisms need to be put in place to allow those adjustments to be made. Because for us to continue thinking that the energy sector is going to provide us with the kind of economic support that we've had in the past, I think the evidence suggests that that is not a sustainable perspective for us in Trinidad and Tobago.
Okay, I want to give me a short answer to two things because we need to break for the news. And I want to ask you if you'd be willing to stay on for about 10 minutes from about 7:10. Can you?
That is going to be a little difficult. I have to prepare for another meeting.
Yes, you had mentioned
from
that to me.
ATS.
Okay, so we're going to close. We're going to close here.
But I would like the opportunity to come back on another occasion if
I will take you up on that. I will take you up on that. But I want to close on this. And the issue I want to close on is really to complete for the public to understand what you have been saying and developing. The first thing that you are saying is that when you take the HSF and the foreign reserves together and the level at which we are borrowing and the problem of the balance of trade and the balance of payments with regard to imports and exports and the state of the energy sector as the main exporting sector, what you are really saying is that the buffers we have are not are not so sound as the Minister of Finance tries to make it out. And the second thing that I want to raise with you, and you can close on this, is that should we feel any comfort whatsoever from the fact that the price of oil is rising now, or that we will have more natural gas in 2022 and 2023?
Okay, well, for the first point, I think your analogy about having...
we have to break for the news.
Having the $5 and borrowing 15, it means that you really don't have $5.
That's right.
And that's the scenario that we're in. And I think we should not be too comfortable in terms of the energy, in terms of the gas prospects, because as I said, our production is down. Some of our plants have actually been mothballed. So all of those prospects really need to be finessed and to looked at very carefully, because I still don't think that with those prospects there, that the energy windfalls that we had in the past, we're going to enjoy in 2022, because we're still going to be recovering from COVID-19 in terms of the wider economic impacts and the levels of unemployment that have occurred because of our measures under the pandemic. That's right, yeah.
Yes. So summary position is that we should not look to oil and gas for any salvation. We've got to begin to restructure the economy and look elsewhere for where we need to go in order to build sustainability.
And to start up with the mechanisms in place to support those alternative sectors that we might want to build moving forward.
All right.
But energy can be part of a suite, but it can't be the only thing that Trinidad looks to for salvation.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Attz. I will take you up on your offer to come again, because we have a lot to discuss, and it's important in the way that you explain for people to understand what is at stake. Because sometimes the Minister of Finance attacks very knowledgeable people in the field for what they say, and sometimes that has a way of undermining what they say. And I think it's important to bring the truth of our situation to the population. Thank you very much. Right now we break for the news, which